Today I'm going to show you how I make a pie crust. It's really quite simple, but I believe there are a few key things to keep in mind that will result in a really nice flaky crust. A pie dough the mixture is not homogeneous, and that's very important. The flakiness of the pie crust results from the interaction of heating up the dough, which is a mixture of moistened flour and the fat. These two are combined together to make the dough, but it's not a homogeneous mixture. Each part is in separate particles. So with that in mind, I have everything in the refrigerator ready to go. So let me go get the butter and we'll start with that. As you can see, I've already cut up some of the butter, but I'm going to just cut this last little bit to show you how I do it. I've been using the shorter, fatter sticks of butter, and I cut them into quarters. If you were using the longer, skinnier ones, I would cut them into thirds instead. So I cut them one way, and then the other, and then I slice off little cubes. 3 more slices, and then I break them up into little pieces. I've also done the same with the shortening, and since the shortening is so much softer than the butter, the shortening is actually in the freezer right now, staying nice and cold. So this recipe uses 2/3 butter and 1/3 shortening. It results, the crust that this makes seems to be nice and flaky, and it's easy to work with. So those are the proportions I use. So now let me go get the flour. As you can see, I measured the flour. This is 2½ cups of flour, 2 tablespoons of sugar, and a teaspoon of salt. And I mixed them together and put the whole food processor bowl in the refrigerator to stay nice and cold. So I'll mount that here on the food processor. And then I sprinkle these cubes of butter over the top of the mixture. Mix them in a little bit just to get them below the surface of the flour. I like to get a little bit of flour covering each little cube so they don't tend to stick together. And then I give about 6 1-second pulses. I shake it up a little bit to knock the flour off the sides of the bowl as we continue. Okay, so that's pretty well incorporated. So now let me go get the shortening. As you can see, I've been keeping the shortening here in the freezer. The shortening is so much softer than the butter. That's why I put the butter in first to mix it up, because it does take a little bit longer to cut up the harder bits of butter. Those in there and mix them up a little bit. Toss them around in the flour. There we go. And then I'll give it about 5 or 6 more pulses. You can see, let me take this off here, you can see the mixture looks a little bit like wet sand, and that's just about right. If you rub it between your fingers very gently, you can feel the little particles of fat in there, and it's not just a big old paste. So now I'll go get the bowl, the mixing bowl, which I've also been keeping in the refrigerator. So this is nice and cool, which will help keep the fat from melting while we mix in the water. So I spread this out a little bit, make some little pockets in it, and we'll mix the water in tablespoon by tablespoon. In the past, I would just go and dump the recipe I usually use calls for 6 to 8 tablespoons of water, and in the past I would just dump it in and mix it, and I'd frequently get results I didn't really care for. And then I figured out that if I sprinkle the water over the mixture tablespoon by tablespoon and mix it in, that the results were a lot better. So I usually start with 2 tablespoons, and then I mix it in like so, just sort of tossing the flour mixture around with the water so that it's nicely incorporated, so you don't get some spots that are incredibly wet and other spots that are very dry. There's number 3. And I just keep going along like this. I usually, since here in Colorado it's really dry and our flour is really dry, I usually use all 8 tablespoons. 4. And usually after about 5 or 6 tablespoons, the dough starts to clump up a little bit. As you can see some little clumps forming now. There's 5. And 6. So now you can see I'm really starting to get quite a number of clumps. So then I take the back of the fork like this, and I kind of press down on the clumps, breaking them up. And incorporating more of the unmoistened flour in with the flour that is moistened already. Here's number 7. It doesn't pay to be too stingy with the water, because if you're too stingy with the water when you go to roll out your pie crust, the dough has a tendency to crack rather than expand. So I just go ahead and use plenty. That's a little bit shy, so that's going to get a little bit more. So, try to make this get the water incorporated throughout pretty well. I'm doing this with the fork. Keeps my hands out of there for the most part, so I don't heat up the dough too much. And I think I'm getting it. You can see how the dough is hanging together pretty well. Which tells me that it's pretty well incorporated. Alright, so that takes care of that part. I use a rubber spatula and bring this together. I've read a number of recipes where they talk about sort of kneading it together with the rubber spatula, but I've never been able to do that very well. So after I get it gathered together pretty well, I just use my hands, and I just try to be quick about it. So knead it a little bit. Drag it around to pick up the small pieces. And can see now I've got a nice ball of dough. This is enough for a 2-crust pie. Make it nice, try to make it nice and round. And then you have to divide it into a bottom crust and a top crust. I usually cut it a little off the side, so because the top crust doesn't usually take quite as much as the big crust, as the bottom crust. So then I have these 2 pieces. So now we wrap them up in some plastic wrap. I do this, we wrap them up and flatten them out into a disc shape. Here we go. Take the dough and put it on here, flatten it out into a disc, and I wrap it up like so. You go around the edges and to close up the little cracks that tend to form. Just that one. And then the top crust. Do the same. So there we have our 2 pieces of crust, and I'll now put them in the refrigerator. And well, I like to let them sit at the refrigerator for at least an hour, and preferably overnight, to allow the moisture that's in the flour to disperse fully through the dough, so you don't have wet spots and dry spots. And so after these rest in the refrigerator for several hours, I'll show you how to form it into a pie crust and put it in the shell and put a filling in it and maybe a top crust. See you then. When I left you, I had put the pie dough that we'd made in the refrigerator, wrapped in plastic, so that it could the moisture could distribute itself fully. And now it's been resting overnight in the refrigerator, and we're ready to roll it out. So first thing to do is to flour the pastry cloth. I usually sprinkle a little bit of flour on there and kind of rub it in a little bit, and then sprinkle on a little bit more, and then unwrap the disc of pie dough. And I usually sprinkle a little bit more flour on it. So before I do that, you can see here the little bits of fat sprinkled in throughout the pie dough. So it's it's not just a homogeneous mixture. It's more like concrete than epoxy. So you have these little bits of fat mixed in amongst the moistened flour, and this is what's going to result in a nice flaky pie crust. So do that. If your pie dough is really cold and hard, you might have to wait for a while for it to warm up so you can roll it out. But I think this is going to work okay. So we'll just give it a try. So I try to work out from the center. There's nothing, just a standard rolling technique. Try to make it round. So I work away at little edges of it. If I see that it needs a little elongation on a particular side to keep it round, I will roll there. And I'm also trying to keep it a relatively uniform thickness. So. Then here I have a ruler this one's 13 inches, and 13 inches turns out to be just about the right size. And as you can see, we're not quite there yet. least 13 inches is about the right size for the particular rather deep pie plate that I use. So look at that. That's mostly there. Okay, I think that's going to do. Yes. Alright, so I have the pie plate in the freezer, staying nice and cool, so let me go get it. Set it right here. So what I do is I put the rolling pin right in the middle of the crust. I just sort of roll the crust onto the rolling pin, and then I can very nicely lay it onto the pie plate. And I lift the edge, slide it down in there. Try to get it relatively even. It's a little low in one spot, but that's okay. Get it pressed, just press it down a little bit just to get it snugged into the bottom corners. And then now we're going to put it in the refrigerator for 40 minutes to let it rest. And while it's doing that, I'm going to roll out the pie dough for the top crust. Back up. So this is the smaller piece of pie dough from when I divided it yesterday. I made the top piece a little bit, tiny bit smaller than the bottom piece. So let me open this up. Put it there. This pie is going to have a lattice top crust, so I'm going to roll this out, but I'm not going to roll it out in a round shape. I'm going to roll it out into an oblong so I can cut strips. So it's going to try to make it more rectangular than round. And I'm going to roll this out to about 13 inches long and about 8 inches wide, I guess. Let's see, that's not quite long enough. So I need to cut 10 strips out of this. About getting there. Okay, let's see. I'm going to make it just a little bit longer. Alright, that ought to work. So I have this pastry cutter. I use one that's has a little fluted sort of edge, which would make it look like it was cut with pinking shears, but you could also just use a regular knife for this. So I'm going to start by trimming a relatively straight edge on here. And then I'm going to make 10 strips about I guess about 3/4 of an inch wide. Doesn't have to be exact. I try not to let that curl up on there, but it always does. And I just cut one and move it over here. back and cut the next one. I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of flour on here so I don't have so much trouble with my ruler sticking. There we go. And you can see they're not perfectly parallel, but nobody's ever going to notice. Haven't yet had anybody complain to me that the strips weren't perfectly perfect. And go along. There's half of them. Looks like this is going to be wide enough for the other half. Not quite wide enough. There we go. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3. So I just need 2 more. And sometimes I cut an extra one just to be sure, because you never know when you're putting one of those on the pie that it doesn't break. So having an extra never hurts. And there we go. So these will also go in the refrigerator for 40 minutes or so to rest. I have this flexible cutting board that I can sprinkle a little bit of flour on. This one has a little texture on this side of it, so the flour kind of goes in the little grooves. And I'm just going to slide these on here so I can transfer them to the refrigerator. Oh, there's no good way to do this. If I'd been thinking ahead a little bit better, I would have done this. I would have just put them on here to begin with, and I wouldn't have to move them again. There we go. All right, and then those go right in the refrigerator for 40 minutes to rest. In the meantime, we'll work on the pie filling. So for the filling for the cherry pie, since I don't have any fresh tart cherries, I ended up using canned ones. So I took 2 cans of, or 2 15-ounce cans of pitted cherries, and I drained them. And as you can see, it only makes about 3 cups. And it's better to have 5 or 6 cups of cherries. So what I ended up doing was I took the drained juice from the canned cherries, and I took 2 sacks of 2 5-ounce sacks of dried cherries, and I stewed them on the stove, which plumped up the dried cherries and also reduced the cherry juice to more like a syrup. So we're going to mix these all together. Canned cherries. Here are the stewed dried cherries. And mix Mix them together a little bit. And to that I'm going to add a cup of sugar. This is 5 tablespoons of cornstarch, although with this amount of juice that's in here I might add yet another one. So I'm going to add the cornstarch. And this is a dash of salt, pinch of salt, and a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon. And let me mix that up. I know the canned cherries look a little pale and don't look quite as vivid as nice fresh cherries, but I suppose one could put a little bit of red food coloring in there if you wanted to, but that's so easy to overdo, I'm just not going to. And to that, I'm going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of almond extract. Got a little bit more than I bargained for. It's one of the reasons why you're never supposed to measure things over the mixing bowl. If you slop a little bit, if you pour a little bit too much, you can get unexpected results. I'm going to add a little bit more cornstarch to this, but then when our pie crust is finished resting in the oven, we will put it together. The pie crust has rested in the refrigerator for 40 minutes, and now we're ready to fill it and create the top crust. You can see here we have the pie crust, and it's got some parts that are a little bit high and some other parts that are a little bit low. I usually go around and trim it. I usually trim it to about, about 3/4 of an inch above the edge of the pie plate. So I'm just going to even this up a little bit. For this pie plate, the 13-inch circle is a pretty good match, so other than just evening it up, I'm not really taking too much off, although this spot has a little bit more, which we're actually going to need, because as you can see, this spot right next to it isn't quite high enough. So let's continue around here. Just make it even. Oops. And there we go. One little snip there. You can see we have this one spot here that's a little bit low. So what I'm going to do is, I've got a little bit of water here. Got a little break there, you see. I'm just going to put a little bit of water there, pinch that together, and I'm just going to pinch this a little bit, make it a little bit thinner. And then I will take this piece and do the same thing with it. Just squeeze it a little bit to make it about half the thickness it was. A little water on it, paste it on the edge, and kind of smush it all together. When we go to trim that off, nobody will be the wiser. There we go. Okay, so here I have the cherries and the sugar and cornstarch and the cinnamon and almond extract mixture. And you can see it's pretty liquidy, so I did put a couple extra tablespoons of cornstarch in there. And so that goes into the shell. And we'll just scrape that in there.
see, it's not going to make the thickest pie in the world, but it's going to be pretty good. Hopefully I've got, you can see there's quite a bit of juice in there. Hopefully I've got enough cornstarch in there to solidify it. So we'll find out when it's done. Now comes the fun part with the lattice crust. So here I have my lattice pieces. I'll just put them on the side. So what I usually do is start with a nice long one and lay it across the middle. So this is going to have 5 pieces in each direction. And what I do is, this is going to trim the end of this a little bit. And ultimately what I'm going to want is the lattice pieces are going to come about halfway between where the top of the filling and the edge of the crust. But I usually trim one end and line it up on one end and leave the other one for now. So then I take a shorter one, do the same sort of thing. And then I'll take a short one and put it here. And you have to remember you have to leave a nice long one for the lattice pieces going in the opposite direction, or the cross direction. There we go. Alright, let me trim these off. And I trim these, the ones on the side, they get trimmed off at an angle to match the edge of the crust. There we go. And these ends get trimmed a little bit too. Okay, so those are the ones that go across that way. So then, when I'm going to lay the center one, I'll take 2 of these, fold them back, and I select a nice long one for the center, and it goes right down the center like so, and then these get folded back. You can kind of even this up a little bit and make everything look nice and straight, and then you fold back the other 3, put another one in there, fold those back, and then finally we fold the first 2 back again and stick another one in there, like so, folding that back. And then these get trimmed off again. Scissors are really the easiest way to do this. There. And so then we fold these 2 back. Oops. And fold 3 back. And this one goes. Some people actually lay this out on a piece of wax paper and then transfer it to the top of the pie, but I've never tried it that way, but I suppose it could work. There. All right. So, then you can take your pastry brush with a little bit of water on it, and I go around to this over here. I wet the backs of these little pieces and stick them down. Just takes a little dab of water just so that those don't go anywhere. Some of these look like I trimmed them off a little too short, but you can always stretch them a little bit. And the last one. So those are all glued down, so then I get my brush wet again and I just paint a little bit of water all around the edge. And then I fold it over, trapping the little lattice, the ends of the lattice in the folded over part of the crust. You notice I'm not crimping it at this time, I'm just folding it over. Try to get it relatively even. There, and once that's relatively evened up and rolled over, I dry my fingers a little bit. And I take my fingers like this, and we're going to crimp the edge of the crust going like so, and then we'll make it a nice decorative fluid look, just like that. You can see it's really quite easy to go over all the way around the crust, crimping and fluting until it's nice and sealed. And you may be wondering how I'm going to make this come out even at the end, but it never really does, but then it never really matters because you can just kind of keep crimping around again and stretching some of the flutes. So there's the lattice. Then what I do, got my paintbrush again, I've got a little half and half. You can use a beaten egg yolk for this if you want, but half and half works well enough. And I go around and, put it on the fluted edge. If you wanted to take the time, you could go like this, but it seems like I'm almost never diligent enough to do that. But I'll do it this time, just for the sake of evenness. There, and then I get some more cream and I paint a little bit on each one of these pieces of lattice. Sometimes it's easier to do all one direction and then the other. There we go. That's pretty well even. And then my last gesture, I've got this coarse sugar in the raw, or demerara sugar, or turbinado sugar, whatever you want to call it, and I get a little bit on the spoon. And this is where it usually starts getting messy. I just kind of sprinkle it over the lattice where it sticks to the half and half, and then when it bakes on there, it's going to look really pretty, or at least interesting. Oops. And you can see you can get too much, but it's, one could argue there's never too much. Too much is impossible, but there. So then it goes in the oven. It's goes in a 450 degree oven for 30 minutes, and then we turn it down to 375 for another 30 minutes or so until it's nice and golden brown and set. So we'll do that and we'll see what we get. Now I'm going to show you how to make a pre-baked pie shell, what's also sometimes called a blind crust. The dough that I'm using is a little bit different than the dough that I used for the other crust, and this one is leaner. And since it's a single shell with no top to it, I used half the amount of flour but only about a third the amount of fat. And the reason being that a leaner crust is better at holding its shape when you bake it. And since it's a blind crust, since you're baking it with no filling in it, it needs some additional help keeping its shape. So, as you can see, I've rolled out the dough. I put it in the pie plate, and I've trimmed the edge. So it's all we have to do is create the flute and go from there. So, again, with the paintbrush and the water. This time, I'm going to do this on the underside of the crust. And so I'll paint this all the way around. This is so we can, unlike the other crust where I folded this edge over the top, this one's going to get folded down so that it will look prettier. As you can see, this edge, I trimmed it and I put a few patches on it because it always seems like it always needs a little patching. So in any event, now after it's wet, you fold the edge down and under a little bit, still leaving it stick up a little bit above the edge of the pie plate. And just continue around. Notice again that I'm not crimping it, I'm just shaping it. Wait until we get it all evenly done before crimping it. Okay, so there, it's pretty even. Dry my hands off. And again, just like before, just go around with my thumb and fingers like this, going around and crimping the edge. Oops. Looks like I got one edge of the dough thicker than the other. It's kind of hard to get it really even, especially this leaner dough is harder to roll out than the rich dough. There. And so then now it's ready to go into the refrigerator and rest for a while before baking. But this when we bake this, if I were to bake it just like this, it would probably roll in and it would slump. And since we don't want that to happen, I'm going to line it with some aluminum foil. It's a doubled up piece of aluminum foil, and then
it will eventually get some pie weights to hold the crust in place. So here I have a piece of doubled up foil. And sort of carefully push it in here. Be a little bit careful doing this so that you don't mangle the edge of the crust. And get it seated all around the inside. And I push it up against the sides. So, as you can see, and these edges can stick up. I usually bend them in a little bit just so they're not going to interfere with the baking of the shell. And there, I think that's just about it. So this is going to go in the refrigerator and rest for 40 minutes, and then I will put it in the freezer for 20 more minutes, and then it gets baked at 375 degrees for about 25 minutes, and then I will pull the aluminum foil with the pie weights out and bake it for about another 15 minutes, and then it'll be done and ready to receive a filling that doesn't need to be cooked. So, off we go into the refrigerator. The pie crust has been in the refrigerator for 40 minutes, and then I put it in the freezer for 20 more minutes. You can see I still have the aluminum foil lining in there. And now I'm going to take these ceramic pie weights, pie crust weights. You can see they're little ceramic, like little ceramic peas. Pour them in here. This is supposed to be enough for 2 pie crusts, but I just have gotten used to using all of them, and I push them up against the edge. And then we'll put it in the oven and we'll cook it for about 25 minutes. And then I'll remove the aluminum foil and the pie weights and bake it for another 15 minutes until it's nice and dry and golden brown. Well, I've taken the pie and the crust out of the oven. They're fully baked now. So I want to show you what how this lattice turned out. You can see that it still has pretty good definition. The little pinking edges didn't spread too much. The more rich dough that we use here, you can see that the edge kind of puffed up a little bit, and it got a little sort of melty looking, but it looks okay. And evidently, it looks like I got enough cornstarch in the filling, because it doesn't look like it's sloppy. And then we have the pre-baked pie shell, which is ready for a filling that doesn't need to be cooked. I'm probably going, since Colorado peaches are in season right now, and we have some that are ripening up, that's going to become a fresh peach pie. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my little demonstration how to do a pie crust, and happy baking. Et voila.
Don't forget the ice cream.
No, I don't know if I can get the ice cream out of it. It must be too cold still. Guess not. There we go. Hold on.
his piece of pie.
That's right.
It's heaven.